Reborn, I returned to the night of the betrayal. I clapped as my fiancé proposed to his mistress. Fire crackled in the overturned chassis of my car, painting the snowy London night in jagged strokes of orange. Metal crushed my ribs, stealing my last breaths, while my phone screen glowed on the dashboard. A photo of Julian kissing Daisy. Dying wasn't the tragedy. Realizing I had wasted a decade loving a man who never looked at me was the true catastrophe. Gasping for cold air, darkness swallowed my vision, only to shatter into a blinding crystalline light, blinking against the sudden brilliance. The suffocating smoke vanished, replaced by the scent of expensive lilies and chilled champagne. Crystal glasses clinked like wind chimes. A string quartet played a soft rendition of a classical waltz in the corner of the Savoy Hotel ballroom. I stood frozen, my fingers wrapped so tightly around a flute of Dom Perignon that the stem threatened to snap. The suffocating smell of burning rubber and my own blood was gone. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of Daisy Harrington's signature perfume, Le Labo Santal 33. A scent I had grown to loathe over a miserable, tortured decade. I blinked, the dizziness of sudden relocation washing over me. I looked down at my hands. They were unscarred. The intricate, horrifying web of scars I had acquired from the crash was completely gone. I was wearing the custom emerald green Carolina Herrera gown I hadn't seen since the winter of 2021. Looking around, the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I was 26 again. This was the Sterling Cavendish annual charity gala. This was the night my life had ended the first time. "Julian, what are you doing?" A hushed, breathless voice whispered through the sudden, stifling silence of the ballroom. I looked up. The crowd of London's elite city financiers, property tycoons, and old money Mayfair socialites had parted into a circle. In the center stood Julian Cavendish. He was as breathtakingly handsome as my cursed memory recalled. Sharp jawline, midnight dark hair swept back, and wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. But he wasn't looking at me. His stormy gray eyes were entirely fixated on a petite, trembling woman standing before him, Daisy. She wore a simple, ethereal white dress that made her look like a fragile snowdrop surrounded by wolves. She had returned from Paris only 3 days ago, claiming she was heartbroken and lost. That was all it took. Julian dropped slowly to one knee. The collective gasp of 200 guests sucked the oxygen from the room. Everyone knew Julian Cavendish and Clara Sterling were supposed to announce their engagement tonight. Our families had basically merged our lives since we were children. The ring in his pocket was supposed to be mine. Daisy. Julian's voice was thick with an emotion I had spent 10 years begging to hear. I was a fool to let you get on that plane 3 years ago. I've spent every day since realizing that my life is hollow without you. Marry me. He pulled open a black velvet box. A massive pear-shaped diamond caught the light of the chandeliers. In my previous life, this was the exact moment I shattered. I had dropped my glass, screamed his name, and ran into the center of the circle, sobbing uncontrollably. I had humiliated myself, demanding to know why he was doing this, bringing up our families, the millions my father had invested in his struggling tech firm, and the decade I had spent unconditionally by his side. Out of guilt and intense pressure from his furious father, Julian had closed the box, dragged me out of the room, and eventually reluctantly married me. That marriage had been a tomb. He resented me. He kept Daisy as his assistant, spending late nights comforting her while I waited up in a cold, cavernous house, drinking myself to sleep until the night my car spun out on black ice. A sudden, sharp laugh bubbled up in my throat. The sound was so foreign, so utterly devoid of despair that it startled even me. The crowd's murmurs died instantly. Hundreds of eyes pivoted toward me, the jilted soon-to-be fiancé, expecting a catastrophic meltdown. Julian's head snapped in my direction, his brow furrowing. He looked braced for an impact, ready for my tears, ready to play the tragic hero trapped by a hysterical woman. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. The cold liquid slid down my throat, grounding me in the beautiful reality of my second chance. I set the glass onto a passing waiter's silver tray with a soft clink. Then I raised my hands and began to clap, 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 clap slow, steady, and loud. "Bravo," I said, my voice echoing through the opulent hall, carrying not a single tremor. I smiled, a genuine, radiant curve of my lips. "What a beautiful surprise. Congratulations to you both. Julian's jaw slackened. The romantic defiance in his eyes was instantly replaced by profound confusion. Clara, he murmured, half rising from his knee, the velvet box wobbling in his grip. Daisy, sensing the shift in attention, let out a delicate, tragic sob, covering her face. Clara, please don't be angry, she whimpered, her voice dripping with practiced vulnerability. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. We just couldn't fight our hearts. Angry? I echoed, stepping forward. The crowd instinctively parted for me. I stopped a few feet away from them, looking down at Julian, who was still hovering awkwardly halfway off the floor. I felt nothing. No heartache, no jealousy, no desperate need to be chosen. The emotional umbilical cord that had tied me to this man for a decade had burned away in the wreckage of my past life. Daisy, darling, why would I be angry? I said smoothly, my tone conversational and light. You've just saved me the trouble of returning a ring I never wanted. I looked at Julian, meeting his bewildered gaze. She's all yours, Julian. I wish you both exactly what you deserve. Before he could formulate a response, I turned on my heel. The silk of my gown swept across the marble floor. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked out of the Savoy ballroom with my head held high, leaving a stunned silence in my wake, feeling the glorious, intoxicating rush of absolute freedom. The penthouse in Canary Wharf was a monument to my foolish devotion. I had designed every inch of the 4,000 square foot space to suit Julian's minimalist, brooding tastes, slate gray walls, imported Italian leather furniture, and not a single piece of my own vibrant artwork. I had erased myself to become the perfect backdrop for his life. I arrived 30 minutes after leaving the gala. I immediately went to the master bedroom and pulled my Louis Vuitton trunks from the highest shelf in the walk-in wardrobe. I didn't pack the designer gowns he had chosen for me to wear to his corporate events. I didn't take the expensive, tasteless diamond tennis bracelet he had bought me out of obligation last Christmas. I packed my books, my journals, my favorite comfortable jumpers, and the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to my grandmother. I was zipping up the second trunk when the front door of the penthouse slammed open. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Julian appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his bow tie undone, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted all the way from the hotel. He looked at the trunks on the floor, then at me, standing calmly by the vanity. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Packing," I replied evenly, tossing a silk scarf into a tote bag. "I'll have movers come for the rest of my things on Monday." "Don't worry, I don't want the furniture." Julian stepped into the room, his presence dominating the space as it always had. "Clara, stop this. Stop acting like this." "Like what?" I asked, pausing to look at him. "Like you don't care," he snapped, running a hand through his dark hair, ruining the perfect styling. "You made a scene at the gala. You embarrassed me." I let out a soft scoff, shaking my head. "You dropped to one knee and proposed to another woman at a party hosted by my family, surrounded by my friends and colleagues, when everyone knew we were supposed to get engaged tonight. And my applauding your bravery is what embarrassed you." He winced, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before it hardened back into defensive arrogance. "You know how I feel about Daisy. You've always known she was the one who got away. I couldn't lie to you anymore, Clara. I couldn't trap you in a loveless marriage. In my past life, those words had been a knife to the chest. I had screamed that I didn't care, that I could make him love me. Now, they were just pathetic excuses from a weak man." "I agree," I said simply. "You did us both a massive favor. So, I am leaving. You should be thrilled. You have your white moonlight, Julian. Go celebrate." He stared at me, deeply unsettled. This wasn't the script he had written in his head. He had prepared for a storm, for me to threaten him with my father's money, for me to weep and beg. My apathy was terrifying him. "You're just going to walk away?" he asked, his voice dropping to a suspicious whisper. "Just like that? After 10 years? "Yes." I picked up my tote bag and grabbed the handles of my rolling trunk. "Excuse me, Julian. You're blocking the door." He didn't move. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, his skin hot. "Clara, wait. We need to talk about the company, about Sterling Holdings. You know the Series B funding for my new AI division is supposed to close next week. Your father." Ah, there it was. The real reason he had abandoned his newly minted fiancé to chase after me. Cavendish Enterprises was bleeding cash, and Sterling Holdings was his lifeline. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, my expression turning to ice. "Let go of me." He hastily dropped his hand, taking a half step back. "My father's investments are handled by my family's legal team, not by me," I lied effortlessly. In reality, my father adored me and would burn Julian's company to the ground the second I asked him to. But if I were you, Julian, I'd start looking for alternate capital. The Sterlings don't generally fund men who publicly humiliate their daughters. Clara, business is business. "You wouldn't be that petty," he said, his arrogance flaring again. "We have contracts. Term sheets. Term sheets aren't legally binding, Julian. You, of all people, should know that promises mean nothing until the ink is dry." I gave him one last pitying look. "Have a good night. Tell Daisy I hope she feels better." She looked a little pale. I pushed past him, dragging my luggage down the hall. I didn't look back as I summoned the private lift. The doors slid shut on his bewildered, slightly panicked face. The moment the lift descended, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. "Clara." Sebastian Thorne's deep, gravelly voice came through the speaker. Sebastian was a junior partner at his father's law firm, a brilliant corporate shark, and someone I had foolishly sidelined in my past life because Julian was intimidated by him. "Sebastian, are you awake? It's midnight on a Friday." "Of course, I'm awake. I heard what happened at the Savoy. Are you all right? Do I need to bail you out of a cell for murdering Cavendish?" I smiled, stepping out into the crisp, freezing London air. "No murder, just a change of plans. I need you to draft a withdrawal of all Sterling Holdings funding from Cavendish Enterprises effective immediately. Find every loophole, every exit clause in our existing contracts, and execute them." There was a pause on the line, then a low, dark chuckle. "God, I love it when you're ruthless. Give me 24 hours, Clara. I'll make sure his stock plummets by Monday morning." "Thank you, Sebastian. Where are you going now?" he asked, his tone softening with genuine concern. "To Claridge's," I replied, signaling for a waiting black cab. "I'm going to get the best sleep of my life." 3 weeks passed. In my previous life, these 3 weeks had been a blur of vodka, tear-stained pillows, and desperate, humiliating text messages sent to Julian's phone. In this life, I was reborn in every sense of the word. I moved back into my family's estate in Surrey, much to my parents' delight. My father, Lord Arthur Sterling, was initially furious about the gala, ready to ruin Julian personally. I had calmed him down, explaining that financial ruin was far more elegant and entirely bloodless. I took an executive vice president role at Sterling Holdings, a position I had previously declined because Julian felt threatened by me out-earning him. I threw myself into work wearing sharp Alexander McQueen suits, restructuring our investment portfolios, and spending my evenings having drinks with friends I had neglected for years. Meanwhile, Julian's life was quietly imploding. Without the Sterling Series B funding, Cavendish Enterprises was in freefall. Sebastian Thorne had been a surgeon with the contracts, legally extracting my family's capital and triggering panic among Julian's minor investors. Beyond the financial strain, I knew the reality of living with Daisy was hitting him. Daisy was a professional victim. She was allergic to stress, prone to migraines when things didn't go her way, and required constant, exhausting validation. When I was with Julian, I had managed his diet, his schedule, his family disputes, and his corporate crises, all while making it look effortless, so his ego remained intact. Daisy couldn't even manage to make a dinner reservation without suffering an anxiety attack. The inevitable collision happened on a rainy Tuesday evening at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Sterling Holdings was sponsoring an exclusive gala for a new contemporary art wing. I was standing near a massive abstract painting, nursing a glass of sparkling water, half listening to a French venture capitalist pitch me a green energy startup. "Clara." The voice made the hairs on my arms stand up, but not from affection, from sheer annoyance. I turned gracefully. Julian stood there. He looked terrible. He was wearing a suit, but it looked slightly rumpled. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight. The confident, radiant man who had proposed at the Savoy 3 weeks ago looked completely, entirely eroded. "Julian," I acknowledged smoothly, offering a polite, distant smile. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list." "I bought a ticket," he said, his voice tight. He glanced at the French investor who, sensing the tension, politely excused himself. Once we were alone, Julian stepped closer, invading my personal space. He smelled of stale coffee and stress. "You look incredible," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over my backless black velvet gown. "Thank you." "I feel incredible," I replied cheerfully. "How is Daisy? Is the wedding planning going well?" He flinched at her name. "Clara, please, can we drop the act? I know you're behind Sebastian Thorne's aggressive tactics. You're trying to sink my company." "I am protecting my family's assets, Julian," I said, my voice dropping its cheerful facade, leaving only cold business acumen. "Your new AI division is hemorrhaging cash. Your lead developer quit, and your quarterly projections are a fairy tale. Sterling Holdings doesn't fund sinking ships, it's strictly business. You used to believe in my vision," he pleaded, a desperate edge to his voice. "You stood by me when I started the company in a garage. And you used my family's money and my free labor to build it, only to dump me the second your high school crush batted her eyelashes at you," I countered, my voice low but perfectly level. "You wanted freedom, Julian. You wanted Daisy. You have both, but you don't get to keep my money and my loyalty as severance pay." He stared at me, his jaw working. "Daisy is. She's delicate, Clara. She doesn't understand the pressure I'm under. I can't talk to her about the company. Every time I bring it up, she cries and says I'm ignoring her." He let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. I miss having someone who understands. I miss you." The unspoken words hung heavily in the air between us. In my past life, this was the exact moment I would have caved. I would have offered to help. I would have let him back in, accepting the crumbs of his attention while he kept Daisy safely tucked away in his heart. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of pity. "Then you should hire a better therapist, Julian, because I am no longer your safety net." I took a step back, creating physical distance between us. "Now, if you'll excuse me, there are people here who actually have solvent portfolios I need to speak with." "Clara, wait." He reached for me again, just like he had in the apartment. Before his fingers could graze my arm, a large hand clamped down on his wrist. "I believe the lady said she was finished speaking with you, Cavendish." Sebastian stepped out from the shadows of the next exhibit, impeccably dressed in a dark navy suit, his tall, broad frame completely dwarfing Julian. Julian glared at Sebastian, pulling his arm free. "This is between me and my fiancé, Thorne." "Ex-fiancé," I corrected sharply. "And we have nothing left to discuss." Julian looked back and forth between Sebastian's protective stance and my cold, unyielding expression. The reality of his situation seemed to finally crack through his ego. He had thrown away a diamond to pick up a pebble, and the regret was bleeding into his eyes, dark and heavy. Without another word, Julian turned and walked away, his posture defeated. Sebastian turned to me, a smirk playing on his handsome face. "I was going to let you handle him, but his cologne was offending my senses." "You okay?" "I'm perfect," I said. And for the first time in 10 years, it was the absolute truth. The dominoes were falling exactly as I intended, and I was going to enjoy watching every single one of them crash. Sitting at the long mahogany table, I adjusted the cuffs of my navy blue tailored suit. Beside me sat Sebastian Thorne, flipping through a dense legal dossier with the relaxed confidence of a predator who already knew the hunt was over. Across from us, looking entirely out of his depth, was Julian Cavendish. Julian had spent the last 2 months desperately trying to plug the gaping holes in Cavendish Enterprises' budget left by my family's abrupt withdrawal. Today was his Hail Mary pass. He was pitching a massive buyout to Victoria Wellesley, the senior partner of the firm, hoping she would infuse his failing AI division with enough cash to save his pride. What Julian didn't know, what he was entirely too arrogant to check, was that Sterling Holdings had recently acquired a 40% stake in Wellesley and Partners. When I walked into the room, 10 minutes prior, all the color had drained from Julian's face. "Let's proceed, Mr. Cavendish," Victoria Wellesley said, her voice like cracking ice. She was a woman in her late 50s who suffered fools poorly. "Your quarterly projections are frankly ambitious. And by ambitious, I mean bordering on the realm of high fantasy. Explain the discrepancy between your burn rate and your projected revenue." Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He looked exhausted. The sharp, vibrant man I had loved was entirely gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell running on caffeine and desperation. Well, Victoria, as you can see on slide 4. He clicked a button on his remote. Nothing happened. He clicked it again, harder. The screen remained frozen on the title slide. Julian shot a panicked, furious glare over his shoulder. Sitting in the corner, fumbling with a sleek MacBook, was Daisy Harrington. She was wearing a beige cashmere jumper that looked entirely too casual for a high-stakes financial pitch, and her delicate face was flushed crimson. "Daisy, the next slide," Julian hissed, abandoning his professional tone. "I'm trying, Julian," she whispered back, her voice trembling on the verge of tears. The file crashed. "It says the data is corrupted. I told you I didn't know how to format these specific macros. In my past life, I would have been at that laptop. I would have built the deck, anticipated the software glitch, brought a backup on a flash drive, and handed out perfectly bound hard copies to every investor at the table. I would have seamlessly covered for him, making him look like a genius while I remained invisible. Now I simply leaned back in my ergonomic chair, swirling the black coffee in my porcelain cup, and watched him drown. Do you not have physical copies, Mr. Cavendish? Victoria asked, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow. My assistant was supposed to print them, Julian stammered, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He looked at Daisy, who visibly shrank into her chair, looking like a frightened fawn. It was the exact look that usually made men leap to her defense. Here in a room of corporate sharks, it just made her look incompetent. "We can proceed without the visual aids," I chimed in, my voice smooth and resonant in the quiet room. I opened the file folder in front of me. I have Cavendish Enterprises financials right here, drawn from their last public audit. Victoria, if you look at page 12, you'll see that their vaunted AI division hasn't produced a viable, marketable prototype in 18 months. They are bleeding capital on research and development with zero return on investment. Julian slammed his hands on the table, leaning forward. "Clara, you have no right." "I have every right, Julian," I interrupted, my gaze locking onto his, devoid of any warmth. "Sterling Holdings holds a controlling interest in the capital you are begging for today. I am here to ensure our assets aren't thrown into a black hole. You're doing this on purpose," he accused, his voice rising, shedding all professionalism. "You're trying to ruin me because you're bitter." Sebastian let out a low, dark chuckle, shifting in his seat. He didn't even look up from his dossier. "Careful, Cavendish. Accusing a senior executive of fiduciary sabotage without proof is a quick way to find yourself buried in defamation lawsuits. Miss Sterling is merely reading the numbers. It's not her fault the numbers are appalling. The numbers reflect a temporary setback," Julian argued desperately, looking back to Victoria. "Once the algorithm is finalized, it will revolutionize the logistics sector. We just need a bridge loan." "You don't need a bridge, Mr. Cavendish. You need a miracle," Victoria said, closing her leather-bound portfolio with a decisive snap. "Your company is fundamentally mismanaged. Your lead engineers have jumped ship to your competitors. Your overhead is astronomical, and you bring an assistant to a multi-million-pound pitch who cannot operate a slide deck." She stood up. "Wellesley and Partners passes. I suggest you file for administration before your creditors force you into it." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. Victoria swept out of the room, leaving the four of us behind. Julian stood frozen, his hands still gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. Daisy finally burst into tears, the soft, pathetic sobs echoing in the large room. "Julian, I'm so sorry," she wept, covering her face. "I tried. I really did. It's just so much pressure." Julian didn't rush to comfort her. He didn't wrap his arms around her delicate shoulders and tell her it would be okay. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and profound regret, and looked at me. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice a whisper. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "Happiness has nothing to do with it, Julian. This is just gravity. You built a house of cards on my back and then you decided to walk away. You can't be surprised that it fell down." Sebastian stood up beside me, towering over Julian. "We'll see you in court for the final asset dissolution, Cavendish. Have a good afternoon." I didn't spare Daisy a single glance as I walked out. The white moonlight was losing its glow, entirely useless when the sun finally came out to expose the wreckage. 2 weeks after the catastrophic pitch, London's elite gathered for the winter solstice gala at the Natural History Museum. It was the crown jewel of the social season, a place where fortunes were flaunted and reputations were either cemented or destroyed. I arrived on Sebastian's arm. He looked devastatingly handsome in a midnight blue tuxedo, his hand resting possessively yet respectfully at the small of my back. Over the past few months, our professional alliance had naturally, effortlessly blossomed into something fiercely romantic. With Sebastian, there was no hiding my intelligence, no shrinking myself to fit into his ego. He celebrated my ruthlessness. He matched my ambition stride for stride. The vaulted ceilings of the museum's Hintsa Hall glowed with thousands of candles. A jazz band played softly, and waiters circulated with trays of oysters and vintage champagne. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. "Did you hear about Cavendish Enterprises?" A prominent property developer murmured to his wife as we passed, though loud enough for me to catch. "Stock is trading for pennies. I heard his townhouse in Mayfair is going into repossession." "And look at her," the wife whispered back, nodding discreetly in my direction. "Clara Sterling looks like she hasn't lost a minute of sleep." "Good for her." I took a sip of my champagne, leaning closer to Sebastian. "They're circling him like vultures," I murmured. "London high society doesn't forgive failure," Sebastian replied, his eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. "Especially when the failure is entirely self-inflicted." His gaze snagged on something near the grand staircase. A cruel, satisfied smile touched his lips. "Speaking of self-inflicted wounds, look who decided to show up." I followed his gaze. Standing near the entrance, arguing in hushed, furious tones, were Julian and Daisy. If Julian looked bad at the boardroom, he looked utterly defeated now. His tuxedo looked slightly too big for him, a consequence of the weight he was rapidly losing. But it was Daisy who drew the eye, and not for a good reason. The delicate, fragile flower who had enchanted Julian was currently wearing a look of profound, petulant misery. She was wearing a dress I recognized from 2 seasons ago, a beautiful piece, but an undeniable downgrade for a woman who was supposed to be the fiancée of a tech billionaire. "He shouldn't have brought her here," I said quietly. "It's a Shark Tank tonight." "He didn't have a choice," Sebastian replied, stepping closer so his breath brushed my ear, sending a pleasant shiver down my spine. "I have a friend on the gala committee." Daisy threw a monumental tantrum when Julian suggested they skip it to save money. She threatened to pack her bags. "She needs to be seen. She needs to prove she won the prize." "The prize is currently facing bankruptcy," I noted dryly. "Exactly. Which is why tonight is going to be so entertaining." Sebastian offered me his arm. "Shall we mingle?" We spent the next hour securing 2 massive investments for Sterling Holdings, laughing genuinely with old friends and ignoring the heavy, burning stare of Julian Cavendish, who watched me from across the room like a starving man watching a feast behind impenetrable glass. Eventually, I excused myself to use the powder room. The marble-clad bathroom was empty, save for one person aggressively applying lipstick in the mirror. "Daisy." She froze when our eyes met in the reflection. The air instantly turned toxic. She slowly turned around, her hands gripping the edge of the marble vanity. The sweet, innocent facade she usually wore was cracking, revealing the bitter, frightened woman underneath. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Daisy snapped, her voice devoid of its usual breathy fragility. I walked over to the sink next to hers, turned on the gold faucet, and began to wash my hands. I took my time, enjoying the cool rush of the water. "Enjoying what, Daisy?" Watching Julian suffer, she hissed. "You're punishing him because he loved me more than you. Because he chose me." I turned off the water and pulled a linen towel from the silver tray. I dried my hands carefully, finally turning to look her up and down. "Daisy, I am not punishing Julian. Julian is punishing Julian. I simply stopped being the shield that protected him from his own incompetence." "You took your family's money away out of spite," she accused, stepping toward me. "You ruined his company." "My family's money was an investment in a man I thought was my future husband," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "When he broke that contract, the capital left with me. Did you really think in your vast, profound naivety that you could steal the life I built for him and keep all the perks? Did you think you got the penthouse, the private jets, and the billion-pound valuation just by batting your eyelashes and playing the victim?" She flinched, her face paling. You didn't want Julian, I continued, taking a step closer, forcing her to back up against the vanity. You wanted the man I curated. You wanted the success I funded. And now that you have the real Julian, a man drowning in debt, prone to temper tantrums, and entirely reliant on a woman to clean up his messes. You're miserable. That's a lie, she whispered, but her eyes darted away from mine. Then go be poor together. I smiled, a cold, sharp curve of my lips. Go live in a 2-bedroom flat in the suburbs. Clip coupons. Support him while he tries to rebuild from scratch. Because that is your reality now. Daisy stared at me, her chest heaving, tears welling in her eyes. But this time, they weren't for show. They were born of genuine terror. She had secured the ring, but she was realizing too late that the kingdom she thought she was inheriting was entirely built on my gold. I tossed the linen towel onto the counter. Have a wonderful evening, Daisy. Try not to look so miserable. It makes Julian look bad. I walked out of the powder room, leaving her trembling in the quiet marble sanctuary. When I returned to the ballroom, Sebastian was waiting for me with a fresh glass of champagne. You look entirely too pleased with yourself, he murmured, handing me the flute. I just gave Daisy a reality check, I replied, taking a sip. Sebastian's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. Good, because the reality check I'm about to deliver to Julian is going to be significantly worse. He pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket. My private investigator just sent over the file on Daisy's 3 years in Paris. Let's just say the heartbroken lost soul narrative is incredibly creative fiction. The following Monday, the storm that had been brewing over Cavendish Enterprises finally broke. The news hit the financial columns before the market even opened. Cavendish Enterprises was officially filing for administration. Julian's assets were frozen. His company was dead. I was sitting in my office at Sterling Holdings reviewing a new tech acquisition when my assistant buzzed my intercom. Miss Sterling, Sebastian Thorne is here to see you and he brought a guest. Send them in, I replied, leaning back in my chair. The heavy oak doors opened. Sebastian walked in, looking sharp in a charcoal suit, holding a thick manila folder. Behind him, looking like a man being led to his own execution, was Julian Cavendish. Julian was a mess. He hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and he carried the distinct sour smell of stale scotch and defeat. He looked around my massive corner office, the office he had once told me was too masculine for a woman, with a dazed expression. What is this, Sebastian? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Cavendish came to my chambers this morning, Sebastian explained, dropping the manila folder onto my glass desk. He wanted to beg for a settlement. He wanted to know if Sterling Holdings would buy out his failing patents for pennies on the pound to save his personal assets from repossession. I looked at Julian. The man I had spent 10 years trying to please was now standing before me, broken, literally begging for scraps. Sterling Holdings doesn't deal in charity, Julian, I said coldly. Clara, please, Julian choked out, stepping forward, his hands trembling. I have nothing left. The banks are taking the penthouse, they're taking my car. I can't even make payroll for the skeleton crew I have left. Just buy the patents. You know they have potential. They have potential that you squandered, I replied, unyielding. Sebastian smiled, tapping the manila folder. No, it's not. Julian, when you came to me begging for a lifeline, you mentioned that you needed the money to protect Daisy, to give her the life you promised her. Julian swallowed hard, nodding. She's fragile. She can't handle this kind of stress. I have to protect her. That's very noble, Sebastian said dryly. But before you ruin what little credit you have left trying to shield your white moonlight, Clara and I thought you should see exactly who you ruined your life for. Sebastian opened the folder and spread several glossy photographs and translated French financial documents across my desk. What is this? Julian asked, his brow furrowing as he leaned closer to the desk. This is Daisy Harrington's life in Paris, I said, looking down at the documents. She didn't go to Europe because she was heartbroken over you, Julian. She went to Europe because she was chasing a French shipping heir named Jean-Luc Perrant. Julian froze, his eyes locking onto a photograph of Daisy, draped in diamonds, kissing a devastatingly handsome European man on the deck of a yacht. That's impossible. She told me she spent 3 years finding herself. Healing. She spent 3 years spending Jean-Luc's money, Sebastian corrected brutally. Until she got caught sleeping with his business partner. Jean-Luc cut her off immediately. He blacklisted her from every high society circle in Paris. I picked up a bank statement that had been heavily flagged with red ink. But Daisy had developed very expensive tastes. Julian, she racked up over 400,000 euros in debt across various European credit lines. Designer clothes, luxury hotels, private drivers. When the creditors started threatening to seize her passport and throw her in a French prison for fraud, she suddenly remembered she had a billionaire safety net waiting for her back in London. Julian stared at the papers, his breathing becoming shallow, erratic. His hands hovered over the documents as if touching them would make them real. No, she wouldn't do that. She loves me. She came back for me. She came back for your checkbook, Julian, I said, my voice carrying no malice, only the heavy, blunt force of truth. She didn't love you. She loved the version of you that I paid for. She loved the safety I provided. And the second she realized you were broke, she started making other arrangements. I slid the final piece of paper toward him. It was a flight itinerary flagged by Sebastian's investigator just this morning. What is this? Julian whispered, his voice cracking. That is a first-class one-way ticket to Monaco, Sebastian stated. Booked yesterday under Daisy's name. Paid for by a 5-year-old Russian oligarch she met at the winter solstice gala last week. Her flight leaves in 3 hours. She's abandoning you, Cavendish, just like she abandoned Jean-Luc. Just like you abandoned Clara. The color drained completely from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather guest chair. He collapsed into it, putting his head in his hands, letting out a sound that was half sob, half scream. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire reality was a pathetic, self-inflicted illusion. He had thrown away a woman who would have moved mountains for him, who had built his empire and protected his weaknesses, all for a parasitic fraud who was currently packing her bags to flee his sinking ship. Karma wasn't just a concept. It was a perfectly executed legal and financial strategy. I watched him break down in my office, and the most surprising part was how utterly empty I felt toward him. There was no joy in his tears, no vindication in his pathetic state. He was just a stranger who had made a terrible investment. Sebastian, I said quietly, looking away from the weeping man. Please have security escort Mr. Cavendish out of the building, and draft a press release distancing Sterling Holdings entirely from the Cavendish Enterprises bankruptcy proceedings. We don't want the stench of his failure clinging to our quarterly reports. With pleasure, Sebastian said, his eyes warm as he looked at me. Julian didn't fight as Sebastian hauled him to his feet. He didn't say a word. He looked at me one last time, his gray eyes swimming with tears, begging for a sliver of the mercy I used to give him so freely. I simply turned my chair back to my computer screens, dismissing him entirely. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was the sound of absolute peace. I had let go, and in doing so, I had watched the man who broke me completely destroy himself. I smiled, opening the new acquisition file, ready to build an empire that belonged to no one but me. Winter in England has a way of stripping everything down to its bare, freezing bones. It was fitting, really, because that was exactly what the High Court was doing to Julian Cavendish. January arrived with biting winds and the highly publicized liquidation of Cavendish Enterprises. The bankruptcy had moved from a standard administration reorganization to a brutal compulsory liquidation once the creditors realized there was absolutely nothing left to salvage. Julian's assets were seized to pay off the massive mountains of debt he had accumulated, trying to keep his sinking ship afloat, and more importantly, trying to keep Daisy Harrington draped in the luxury she demanded. The auction took place in the grand ballroom of the Dorchester, a venue usually reserved for society weddings and charity galas. Today, it was a graveyard of Julian's ego. I attended with Sebastian. We didn't come to gloat, though I won't deny the poetic justice of the setting. We came because Sterling Holdings was officially acquiring the remaining viable patents of Cavendish Enterprises' AI division for mere pennies on the pound. Sebastian's legal maneuvering had been a masterpiece. He had essentially legally cornered the intellectual property, ensuring no other tech firm would dare bid against us. We sat in the back row. Up front, the auctioneer rattled off the remnants of a man's life. Lot 42, a collection of 6 bespoke Tom Ford suits, excellent condition. Do I hear £20,000? Lot 45, a vintage 1968 Rolex Daytona, bidding starts at £20,000. It was a clinical, humiliating dissection. I watched as the material trappings of the man I had once worshipped were sold off to bargain-hunting hedge fund managers and property vultures. Then the auctioneer's assistant brought out a small black velvet box, placing it under the harsh light of the projector camera. The image of the ring flashed onto the massive screens at the front of the room. A massive pear-shaped diamond. The very ring Julian had used to propose to Daisy. The ring that was supposed to be mine. Lot 50. A custom-designed 5-carat pear-cut diamond engagement ring set in platinum, the auctioneer announced, his voice devoid of any romantic sentiment. Appraised at £250,000. Bidding will commence at £80,000. A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone knew the history of that ring. 85. A man in the third row called out. 90. Another countered. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand. I felt Sebastian's eyes on me, assessing my reaction. He placed a warm hand over mine. Do you want it? He asked quietly. I'll buy it for you right now, and we can drop it into the River Thames. I smiled, turning to look at him. No, but I do know exactly what to do with it. I raised my auction paddle, £150,000. The room went dead silent. Heads swiveled to the back of the ballroom. Seeing Clara Sterling bid on the ring her ex-fiancé had given to his mistress was a level of high society drama they hadn't anticipated. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, before recovering his professional cadence. £150,000 to the lady in the back. Do I hear £160,000? Going once, going twice. Sold to Miss Sterling. Sebastian chuckled softly as I lowered my paddle. I'm going to have the diamond pried out of the setting and auctioned off at the Sterling Foundation Spring Gala, I replied simply. We'll donate every penny to a women's domestic abuse shelter. It seems fitting that something born of such toxic manipulation should be used to help women escape it. Remind me never to cross you, Sebastian murmured, bringing my knuckles to his lips for a brief, warm kiss. As we stood to finalize the paperwork and leave, a harsh, raspy voice stopped us in the aisle. You think this is a game, Clara? We turned. Standing near one of the marble pillars was Charles Cavendish, Julian's father. Charles was a formidable man, a retired corporate raider who had built the Cavendish family wealth before Julian squandered it. In my past life, I had been terrified of him. He was the one who had forced Julian to marry me after the disastrous Savoy proposal, caring only about keeping the Sterling funding intact. Now he just looked like a tired, angry old man. Charles, I acknowledged, my voice cool and polite. I didn't expect to see you here. I came to watch you dance on my son's grave, Charles spat, his face flushing with fury. You orchestrated this. You pulled your family's funding without warning and tanked his valuation. You ruined my son out of petty jealousy. Sebastian immediately stepped between us, his posture rigid. Mr. Cavendish, I suggest you lower your voice and step back. My client owes you no explanation for sound financial decisions. Your client is a vindictive little girl, Charles sneered, though he took a step back from Sebastian's imposing frame. He looked at me, his eyes filled with venom. Julian made a mistake. Yes, but you destroyed his life. He has nothing. He's currently living in my guest house, drinking himself to death. I hope you're satisfied. In the past, the guilt would have suffocated me. I would have believed him. I would have felt responsible for fixing the man I loved. Instead, I felt a deep, profound clarity. Charles, I began, my voice carrying the steady authority of a seasoned executive. Your son destroyed his own life. He took my family's capital and wasted it on a division that produced nothing. He hired incompetent people, ignored his board, and spent corporate funds to impress a woman who was actively draining his accounts. He is not a victim. He is simply facing the consequences of his own profound mediocrity. Charles's face purpled. You listen to me. No, you listen to me, Sebastian interrupted, his tone dropping to a lethal, quiet register. He pulled a folded document from his breast pocket and handed it to Charles. Before you come out in public and accuse Clara of ruining your son, I suggest you hire the best white-collar defense barrister in the country, and you might want to reconsider letting Julian sleep in your guest house. Charles snatched the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the document, and the remaining color in his face drained away entirely. What? What is this? During our due diligence for the IP acquisition, my forensic accounting team found some alarming discrepancies in Cavendish Enterprises' final quarter, Sebastian explained, his voice ringing with cold satisfaction. Your son didn't just mismanage funds, Charles. When the sterling capital dried up, he panicked. He started quietly liquidating his employees' workplace pension matching funds and transferring them into offshore accounts to cover his personal margin calls and Daisy Harrington's European credit card debt. Charles stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. It's wire fraud, embezzlement, and a massive violation of FCA regulations, I added, looking at the broken man before me. Sebastian submitted the findings to the Serious Fraud Office this morning. We didn't ruin Julian. He did it himself, and he is going to prison. We left Charles Cavendish standing frozen in the aisle of the Dorchester, the document shaking in his hands, finally realizing that the son he had tried to protect was not just a failure, but a criminal. News of the criminal indictment broke 3 days later. It wasn't just a quiet scandal confined to the financial pages. It was front-page news across the country. The fall of the Golden Tech Boy. NCA agents raided the Cavendish family estate at 6:00 inches the morning. The news helicopters caught the footage. Julian Cavendish, wearing gray sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, being led out of his father's guest house in handcuffs by 2 stern-faced NCA agents. He looked disoriented, terrified, and utterly defeated. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade had been entirely stripped away. I watched the broadcast from the kitchen island of Sebastian's penthouse, now our penthouse, as we had officially moved in together sipping a mug of black coffee. The screen showed Julian being pushed into the back of a black SUV, his head bowed to avoid the flashing cameras of the paparazzi. Hard to watch? Sebastian asked softly, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. No, I replied truthfully, leaning back into his solid warmth. It feels like watching a movie about someone I barely knew. The man I loved was an illusion I created to survive my own insecurities. That man on the screen is a stranger. Well, the stranger is facing 20 years in HM prison, Sebastian murmured, kissing my cheek. And the story gets better. Did you see the updates on his charming co-conspirator? I turned, raising an eyebrow. Daisy. Sebastian grinned, a wicked, predatory expression. My contacts at the State Department just called. Daisy Harrington's grand escape to Monaco didn't exactly go as planned. He pulled out his tablet and brought up an international news feed. When the authorities opened the investigation into Julian's embezzlement, they traced the offshore accounts. Guess whose name was authorized to draw from the stolen employee pension funds? Daisy, I breathed, a genuine laugh escaping my lips. Exactly. She thought she was just spending Julian's boundless wealth. She didn't realize she was directly spending stolen pension funds. The moment the indictment was sealed, Interpol flagged her passport. Sebastian swiped the screen, showing a grainy photograph taken by a bystander at Charles de Gaulle Airport. It showed Daisy, dressed in head-to-toe Chanel, sobbing hysterically as 3 French police officers escorted her away from the first-class lounge. Her wealthy Russian oligarch was nowhere to be seen. Men like that vanish at the first hint of an international subpoena. She was detained at the border, Sebastian continued, his voice practically purring with satisfaction. Her assets are frozen. Her designer luggage was seized as evidence. The Crown Prosecution Service is currently negotiating her extradition. She's facing charges of receiving stolen property, wire fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion. I looked at the photo of Daisy crying in the airport. The fragile, innocent white moonlight, who had successfully manipulated every man she met, had finally met a system that didn't care about her delicate tears. She couldn't cry her way out of a criminal indictment. She wanted the billionaire lifestyle, I said quietly, setting my coffee mug down. She just didn't read the fine print. The subsequent trials consumed the London social scene for the next 6 months. Julian, isolated and desperate, attempted to throw everyone under the bus to save himself. He blamed his CFO, his board of directors, and eventually he even tried to blame me, claiming my sudden withdrawal of funding caused a temporary lapse in judgment. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for merciless sentencing, practically laughed him out of the courtroom. The paper trail was indisputable. Julian had knowingly, maliciously stolen from the working-class people who had built his company. Daisy's trial was equally pathetic. Extradited back to London, she spent her days in court weeping, claiming she was a victim of Julian's manipulation, that she was just a naive girl who didn't understand finances. Unfortunately for her, the prosecutors produced hundreds of emails and text messages where she explicitly demanded Julian transfer funds to cover her massive European debts, threatening to leave him if he didn't comply. In the end, the jury saw right through them both. They were two parasites who had fed off each other until there was nothing left but rot. Julian was sentenced to 8 years in a Category C minimum security prison, ordered to pay millions in restitution he would never be able to afford. His father disowned him, changing the name of the family trust to entirely cut Julian out, unwilling to let his legacy be tainted by a convicted felon. Daisy accepted a brutal plea deal to avoid a longer sentence. She received 3 years in HM Prison Bronzefield and a lifetime ban from holding any fiduciary position. Every piece of jewelry, every designer dress, and every penny she had hoarded was seized by the government to pay back the stolen pension funds. The day the judge banged the gavel on Julian's sentence, I was sitting in my office at Sterling Holdings. I didn't attend the sentencing. I had far more important things to do. I was finalizing the merger between my family's firm and Sebastian's legal powerhouse, creating an entity that would dominate the city's financial sector for decades. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the London skyline, the sun reflecting brilliantly off the glass towers. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Sebastian. "It's done. 8 years. Dinner tonight at the Ledbury to celebrate our merger. I love you." I smiled, typing back my reply. "Perfect. I love you, too." I locked my phone and took a deep breath. The suffocating weight of my past life, the smell of burning rubber, the desperate yearning for a man who despised me, the agonizing betrayal, was completely gone. In its place was a foundation built on absolute certainty, power, and genuine, reciprocal love. 2 years later, spring in Lake Como, Italy, is a sensory masterpiece. The air smells of wisteria and ancient stone, and the water reflects a blue so vivid it hurts the eyes. I stood on the balcony of Villa del Balbianello, looking out over the shimmering lake. I was wearing a custom-designed Vera Wang gown, simple, elegant, and utterly devoid of the restrictive, heavy expectations of my past. The silk caught the gentle breeze, mirroring the lightness in my chest. "You look ethereal," a deep voice murmured. Sebastian stepped onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. He wore a sharp black tuxedo, looking every inch the formidable titan of industry he had become. "I feel ethereal," I replied, leaning back against his solid chest, interlacing my fingers with his. "Are the guests arriving?" "They are. Your father is currently interrogating the poor Italian sommelier about the vintage of the Barolo, and Victoria Wellesley is already trying to poach 3 of my junior partners near the Antipasto station." I laughed, a bright, unburdened sound. It wouldn't be a Sterling Thorne wedding without a little corporate espionage. This was our wedding day, an intimate gathering of 50 people, only the friends and family who had supported us, who understood the empire we were building together. There were no obligations here, no forced alliances, no desperately seeking approval from men who viewed me as a transaction. I turned in Sebastian's arms, looking up into his dark, intelligent eyes. "Thank you," I said softly. He smiled, reaching up to gently brush a stray curl behind my ear. "For what?" "Being wildly in love with you." "For seeing me," I corrected. "For never asking me to make myself smaller so you could feel bigger. For standing beside me while I burned it all down and helping me build something beautiful in the ashes." Sebastian's expression sobered, turning incredibly tender. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine. "Clara, you were the fire long before I got here. I just had the good sense to stand back and admire the blaze." We kissed, slow and deep, a promise sealed long before the actual vows would be spoken. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, in a grim cinderblock visiting room in HM Prison Dartmoor, Julian Cavendish sat in an oversized grey tracksuit. The man who had once graced the covers of tech magazines now looked 10 years older than his actual age. His hairline was receding. His eyes were sunken and dull. And the arrogant spark that had defined his youth had been entirely extinguished by the brutal monotony of prison life. He was looking at a crumpled 2-week-old newspaper clipping his father had sent him, the only correspondence Charles Cavendish ever allowed. It was a clipping from the society pages of the Times, a high-resolution photograph of Sebastian and me standing on the steps of the newly christened Sterling Thorne Philanthropic Center. I was glowing, looking radiant and powerful, entirely out of his reach. The headline read, London's newest power couple changes the face of corporate charity. Julian stared at the picture of the woman he had thrown away, the woman who had given him everything, who had loved him unconditionally in a life he could barely remember. He traced the edge of the paper with a trembling finger, the crushing weight of absolute, irreversible regret pressing down on his chest. He had traded a diamond for a cheap piece of glass that had shattered in his hands and cut him to the bone. And somewhere in northern England, working a miserable 1-2-hour shift at a discount retail shop in Grimsby, Daisy Harrington wiped the sweat from her forehead. Her probation required her to maintain steady legal employment. Her hands, once soft and adorned with stolen jewelry, were calloused and rough. She looked at the clock, realizing she had 4 more hours of standing on her feet, entirely alone, with no billionaire coming to save her. Karma had not been swift, but it had been absolute. Back in Italy, the string quartet began to play. It wasn't a mournful classical waltz, but a vibrant, soaring symphony. Sebastian offered me his arm, ready to become Mrs. Thorne Sterling, partner. I have never been more ready for anything in my life. I smiled, taking his arm. We walked down the stone path toward the terrace, toward the sunlight, leaving the shadows of the past permanently behind. I didn't just survive my rebirth. I conquered it. I let go of the man who broke me. And in doing so, I finally found myself. Thank you so much for listening to the final chapters of Reborn. I watched him propose. Clara's journey from a heartbroken, discarded fiancé to a formidable powerhouse proves that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger. It's walking away and letting karma do the heavy lifting. Julian and Daisy learned the hard way that a life built on manipulation and stolen loyalty will always collapse. I hope this story reminds you never to shrink yourself to fit someone else's ego and to always know your worth. What did you think of Sebastian's ultimate takedown of Julian's company? And what would you do if you were given a second chance to rewrite your life? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey of hard karma and ultimate justice, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic storytelling session. Until next time, stay strong and write your own beautiful ending.